Okay, welcome back, everybody. Thank you for shortening your coffee break. And we have two talks now before lunch, which are going to be 20-minute talks and then 5 minutes for questions. And our first talk is from Dr. Caroline Howe from University College London. And Caroline's going to give us quite sort of forward-looking talk about potential future research directions which have been generated from the analysis of ESPA work. Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you. So I do apologise if there's any sort of slight overlaps with what Belinda was talking about yesterday. But actually, when I was listening to her talk, it was quite nice to hear that we were actually, a lot of us were beginning to think along the same lines. So I'm going to take that as a positive from here. So the things I'm talking about today are a lot of work I've been doing with Georgina Mace and Helen Such, who's based at a university in Australia. Sort of general thoughts that we've been having about where the future of ESPA research needs to do, not just drawing from the ESPA community itself, but sort of the broader research community as well. That one. So I'm going to start with a quote from John Ruskin. So for those of people who don't know, John Ruskin was a writer, an art critic, a philanthropist who was writing in the sort of 1850s. And he absolutely adored nature. He lived in the Lake District. But he also had strong sort of thoughts about better development for people, particularly those working in the conditions of poor people working in the mills, for example, in Manchester. And he was sort of thought about how you could combine these two ideas. So already 200 years ago, we were beginning to think about these things. This is not a new idea at all. And the quote I've put up here is, to be able to ask a question clearly is 2/3 of the way to getting it answered. I just want you to bear that in mind, because I think some of the issues that we're still having with the ESPA research is perhaps because we're maybe not asking the right question. So the sort of terminology of ecosystem services has sort of has been evolving over time since it was sort of formally conceptualized in 2005 in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. Now, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment was very much sort of moving this sort of left to right process that the services provided by nature were going to provide some form of well-being here, and they had some ideas of those links, what they might be, the sort of the strength perhaps of those particular linkages. But they were very much of the idea that ecosystem services and benefits are one and the same thing. And then in 2011, the UK did their national ecosystem assessment, and they took a slightly different idea of how they defined ecosystem services. So they broke it down a little bit more. So they started with what they sort of termed primary and intermediate ecosystem processes, so such things such as primary production, for example. These then underpinned what we would call ecosystem services, so trees, for example, and then these became your goods and benefits, and these are the things that we actually took out of the environment, because these require other capital inputs. So, for example, here you're looking at these timber boards, that's going to require some form of labour to create those boards. And now by doing that, it means that you can see that actually what it is that you need to value is those benefits. And very traditionally, this was done with a monetary value, but more recently, we've been moving towards trying to find some kind of value that is beyond that monetary value, that sort of underpins more these other sort of ideas of well-being that we're beginning to think, and a lot of people have been talking about over the course of this conference. So this just sort of summarises those definitions. And I just want to point out what I really like about the UK NEA is that actually within its definition itself, it actually specifically states human well-being. It really sort of begins to say that the two things are completely intertwined. You can't think about services unless you're talking about human well-being as well. And I also quite like this definition that Elena Bennett had, which was in a paper that she and colleagues published early this year, where they think of ecosystem services as the concept for expression of values. And I really like that definition because it's actually, again, moving, really beyond that idea of monetary values, but at this sort of trying to sort of capture all those different elements of what people need, what people take from the environment and why they want them. And at the bottom here, this sort of shows, I suppose, the traditional way we've thought about ecosystem services for human well-being. So it's a very, very linear system, as Belinda was saying yesterday. We're very much going from left to right from this. And I've taken biodiversity out here. Biodiversity is slightly complicated. It can be a sort of ecosystem process or function, or such as sort of pollination, for example, but it might also be a benefit as well if you're thinking like a charismatic species, like a tiger. But what it is is that this well-being means that we then have a demand for the benefits that nature is providing. And it's this demand, actually, that creates services. So without that demand, what's going on here, these ecosystem processes and functions would be going on automatically. They would be going on in the background. They're actually nothing to do with people. But it's because we have a demand that we create those services and that need for the environment. And perhaps there might be sort of a need to start thinking slightly differently about how we approach this research. So I'm not going to go into detail. Everyone, lots of you here are funded by ESPA, so you will know this diagram inside out. But the reason why I put it up is that when ESPA was established, it was really quite novel in the way that it put human well-being and poverty reduction right in the middle of that framework. It was central to all the research, and I think that's really key sort of thing to sort of bear in mind as we go forward. So the problem is that despite all, many, many years now of doing ecosystem services research, we still have a lot of issues. We're not getting some of the answers that we were hoping to get. Now, there's sort of quite a lot of reasons for this, and I've sort of defined this as conflicts between these different epistemic communities that we're working across. We've already mentioned that a lot through this sort of conference. There's the natural sciences, the social sciences, and all the sort of everything in between. So you can break these conflicts down into two different categories. So first of all, you have your sort of philosophical and conceptual conflicts. So people hold different values. These underpin the definitions that they choose to use and the assumptions that they then make about their research. And these assumptions then go on to define the frameworks that they're going to use, the questions they're looking at, and ultimately how they collect their data. And then you have your sort of methodological and empirical conflicts. And I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail about some of those. So firstly, if you think about definitions, there's a lot of conflicts over definitions. I've just chosen three main ones here. So firstly, of course, ecosystem services. A lot of people don't even like the term ecosystem services. There's this conflict whether or not you're talking about services or benefits or both together. And also, what is a cultural service? So there's a lot of issues about how you could define them. Going on to sort of well-being, like I said, traditionally well-being has been valued purely from a monetary perspective, but obviously, and the development world has been working on this for sort of 3 decades or so, that actually it's multi-dimensional, but which dimensions are important, which ones hold most weight, how do you measure those, etc. So that causes a lot of problems with your definitions. And then going on to this issue of value. So every time you say the word value, most people think you mean price. And they are completely different terms. So if you take a riverside walk, for example, the price of that riverside walk is 0, but the value of that is greater than 0. And so throughout the rest of this talk, when I'm talking about value, I'm really talking about that sort of more sort of greater than 0 value that we're not talking about. It's not to do with money. And I put a quote at the top here, which is, what right have you to take the word wealth, which originally meant well-being, and degrade and narrow it by confining it to certain sorts of material objects measured by money? I want you to take from that sort of quote, though, is this idea that by choosing our definitions, we often narrow our thought process. And it's very important to bear in mind that other people will have definitions, and we need to be aware of those, particularly in this kind of field that we're working in. And very briefly, this is carrying on from this idea of definitions. So if you even take the definition of poverty, for example, there's 2 definitions here. So both, you can see in here, they have the terms of socially acceptable and basic. So those terms as well are open to interpretation. What do they mean? Obviously, it's quite important, perhaps, that we have a more flexible view, but obviously people may interpret those completely differently, and you may come up with different conclusions. So then moving on to the assumptions, so I've just put up here 2 really main assumptions that underpin a huge amount of ecosystem services for poverty alleviation research. I won't go into detail them now, I'm going to discuss them slightly a bit later and sort of blow them apart a bit. But bear in mind that this is what a lot of research is actually based on. So then moving on to those methodological and empirical conflicts. So first of all, we have a huge disparate data collection. And this is just some examples of some work I've done. So here I was looking at where ecosystem services research is published. This massive column up here is actually in the Journal of Ecological Economics. Most of these other journals are conservation journals or sort of environmental journals. And there's no, listed here, there was no sort of anthropological development journals. And that's not because they're not doing this work, but it's probably because they're using different terminology. And so therefore we're not talking to them, we're missing a lot of data there, and likewise and vice versa from different groups. This other figure here is actually all about the sort of looking at the type of services that people use. There's a huge emphasis on provisioning services, and at the very far end, very little emphasis on supporting services. And then this map is just showing where sort of the studies are geographically, and you can see there are huge gaps, say, for example, in North Africa. And then moving on to these sort of multiple and complicated frameworks. So, and Belinda talked through several yesterday, and Janet Fisher at the beginning of ESPA did a really nice paper where she looked at 9 different 9 different frameworks and tried to compare them. And this was really useful, but even since she's done that, there have been multiple frameworks published, and people often don't know which one to use, or etc. So going on to those emerging generalisations. So sort of summarising some of what I've already said, and Elena Bennett did this as well in that same paper that I commented on earlier. So they acknowledge that knowledge is fragmented between disciplines. Most research is largely conceptual. There has been a lot of focus on developing these frameworks, not so much on the empirical data collection. And often studies only cover one aspect of the interactions between ecosystems and people. And that's probably because it's incredibly complicated, and there have been some attempts to do this with these bundles of ecosystem services, but it is quite complicated to get those nuanced relationships. So some reason I can't count. But anyway, we had 5 emerging generalisations that we just submitted a paper to AMBIO on these, and I'm just briefly talk them through, and then I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about each one. So firstly, demand. So ecosystem services are better defined by the people that derive benefits from them than from the ecosystems themselves. So this is why maybe thinking of taking a different approach to how we look at ecosystem services for poverty alleviation research. Trade-offs. So ecosystem services are co-produced by people, so there's always going to be competition for resources. Thirdly, biodiversity. We would love it if the relationship between biodiversity and ecosystem services and poverty alleviation, human well-being was simple, but it's not, and actually there's very little that's still understood about this relationship. There's a huge sort of research gap there. Thresholds. So again, this has been touched on a little bit by quite a few talks about these sort of the planetary boundaries, etc. But the thresholds aren't just biological; they're also within social systems as well. And these tipping points will obviously influence those trade-offs. We're talking about the decisions that you have to make. And finally, this idea of valuation again. And like I said, it's moving beyond those non-monetary values, but we have to think of some way of working out how to have an equitable sharing of those benefits in light of these trade-offs and these thresholds. We need to think about how we might do that in the future. So going on to the demand issue, obviously, again, this has been presented quite a lot, and I'm not going to go into it in detail, but the reason why I've put it up is because the IPBES conceptual framework, as complicated as it may be, again, puts people at its heart. And I think that's really important, and it's great that that's happened from an international perspective, that actually the research world has decided that is key to understanding these services. So if you think about that demand, there's been quite a lot of work that's been done this year, actually. The problem is if you don't match your supply and demand. So quite traditionally, there's been some great research actually mapping out where supply of ecosystem services are and where they're coming from, but very little focus on where that demand is coming from, what it is that people need and want. And this paper by Yahadin et al. Was done looking at rangelands, and they show that actually if you don't think about supply and demand, you can actually get sort of non-overlap. So particularly, for example, in supporting services here where there's no purple circle at all, there's no overlap between those. And Geisendorfer et al. Define these as mismatches. So I really recommend this paper. It's a really great paper. It's showing that you have these sort of potential supply and managed supply. A lot of focus is on here. But then you also have this interest in this actual demand that's coming from the top. You want to match those together. And they studied a large number of papers, and they found that actually there was a huge number of mismatches recorded in the literature. So this is how I've sort of conceptualized how we've been thinking about ecosystem services research for poverty alleviation. So very traditionally, it's been in this circle here, and there has been this sort of linear flow to human well-being, and obviously there's been a whole field of development. That's not my area of expertise that's been going on with respect to human well-being, but actually there needs to be this shift across here, so you're focusing on the fact that these arrows are here, they're not linear. They are two-way interactions between the things. There are going to be feedback loops, etc., and we need to incorporate that idea of demand. So moving on to the issue of trade-offs, So this is work that I've done with Georgina and Helen Such. And so first of all, what we did is we wanted to know whether or not this sort of assumption that we said that if you manage your ecosystem services, you are going to alleviate poverty. We then ran in straight away into a problem of definition. By alleviation of poverty, you should be talking about poverty reduction, but actually what most people talk about is poverty prevention, partly because it's easier to measure and to study. But regardless of your definition that you take, we actually found no empirical link between the two. That's not to say that there isn't, but as yet the data doesn't seem to suggest that there is an empirical link. Then moving on to this sort of assumption that if you manage your ecosystem services, you're going to get these win-wins. And we actually found that trade-offs are recorded 3 times as often as synergies in the literature. And we also found out that trade-offs were more common when at least one beneficiary has a private interest and when provisioning services are involved. And this sort of makes sense from the sort of logical capitalist idea we might have. It's quite nice to improve it empirically. So moving on to the issue of biodiversity, this is not my favourite diagram, it's not quite finished product here. So this is a paper that I'm hoping to submit later this year, where what we were looking at is what metrics of biodiversity were underpinning different services, underpinning different benefits, and ultimately going on to human well-being. So we had about 300 papers, and we looked at the kinds of metrics of biodiversity that they were using. They sort of broadly broke down to these 4 categories. And you can see some of them make logical sense. So diversity often underpins species. The thicker lines indicate how often those are underpinning those different services. We've simplified the services into 5 very basic services here. But you can see that this diagram is beginning to get quite complicated. So if you take that to the next level and you add in the benefit level, you can see it's sort of starting to blow up. The system is becoming incredibly complicated. Now, imagine if you put human well-being as the next level on that, you would struggle to say there was any evidence that diversity was underpinning, I don't know, education, for example. But actually, it's worth bearing in mind that if you perhaps ask the question first, what do people need or want from the environment, and then track that backwards, you may be able to come to some potential link to biodiversity. I haven't tried it, so I don't know whether or not that's true or not, but that's a sort of a food for thought. So then moving on to those tipping points, those planetary boundaries. So this diagram just shows that when we're talking about these tipping points, you start off with a stable system, you go through a period of instability, and then you finish off with a new stable system that's obviously going to be different from the one you had before. And then moving on, obviously a lot of people have talked about these planetary boundaries here, first done in 2009, recently updated, and with more data of where we're actually pushing those boundaries. But like I said, it's not just those biological systems that have boundaries, it's also the social systems that have boundaries as too. And this is Kate Raworth's Oxfam donut that she did in 2012. So in the middle, she's got these sort of social boundaries that we have to think about as well. So sort of things like health, social equity, energy, etc. And actually what it is that we have to live within that donut. So then finally moving on to the issue of valuation. Like I said, traditionally this has often been done through monetary measures, but there are a lot of issues with that. So often it's sort of done in an aggregated fashion, and there's no distinction between groups or gender or geographical areas or level of dependence, etc. And Tim Dodd has done a lot of work on this need to sort of disaggregate your data and sort of to show this. It also fails the laugh test. And the laugh test is where basically the idea that $1, it means the same to someone who's incredibly rich as to someone who's incredibly poor, which is obviously complete nonsense. And also it excludes elements of well-being, because well-being has this value and not just a price. So if we're going to move beyond that, what kind of options do we have? So I'm just putting this one forward. So this is some work that I've just submitted with colleagues in the University of Singapore, which is the idea that actually health might be that sort of intermediary between sort of a value for human well-being and a value for ecosystem services. So what we did is we broke down all the, sorry, that's not come up very well on the slide, but you break down all your ecosystem services into a series of health benefits, and they can be anything from sort of providing shelter that you might get from, sort of trees or mangroves or something. You can have psychological benefits, you walk in the green countryside, etc. And obviously your sort of disease things, malaria, etc. Other sort of physiological things, so reduced heart disease or something like that if you take a lot of walks. And that actually then if you can you can have a value for that health benefit, that will sort of be an indicator of human well-being that will also encompass these sort of ideas of ecosystem services. And the thing that we proposed was that you could use dailies. So dailies are disability-adjusted life years. They've been well established by the World Health Organization. And basically what they state is that everybody has sort of an average lifespan, during the so your lifespan is reduced due to different weightings. So if you're exposed to malaria, for example, or you have a really unhealthy diet, so you perhaps have an increased risk of heart disease. You eat too many sausages these days, that won't give you cancer. So those kind of things, and the idea is that perhaps you could use that as a method of valuing ecosystem services. Oh, sorry. So. It's about the I keep going on, we shouldn't have any more frameworks. In the paper we did about the generalisation, we did sort of suggest at the very end perhaps a new framework. As you can see, this is actually not that new, really, in the sense that it is based on the ESPA framework. It's still got people at its heart. But what it has done, and this is quite similar to the stuff that Jeff was presenting yesterday evening, which was that actually what you need in the middle is this is decision-making in institutions. They're in the middle, because those are the things that actually can manage the sort of the links between the two, because the ecosystems and those processes and functions will go on regardless. And then obviously you're going to have your indirect and direct drivers sort of linking between the two. So yeah, it's just a sort of proposed idea. Ooh. So finally, just finishing with another quote by John Ruskin, which is, what we think or what we know or what we believe in is at the end of little consequence. The only consequence is what we do. And the reason why I just put that here is I think actually we're fundamentally all wanting the same thing. We just think about it in slightly different ways. But if we can obviously work together, hopefully we will achieve our outcomes. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Right, we've got time for 2 or 3 questions.
Silence, everybody.
Stunned. Oh, let me just... Let's start here and then go to...
So Colin Bowe from Liverpool John Moores University. So I like the way you put up the kind of different issues around valuation of ecosystem services, or around the ecosystem service concepts. In my opinion, or one idea that I've been having is that, so there's been a bit of pushback against valuing ecosystem services from certain groups over the last few years. But it really feels to me like, by doing valuation studies like what I've been doing here, and the various valuation studies that are going on around the community in terms of valuing with business, valuing with different stakeholders, all that type of thing, that can help to try and help us look into and try and drive the motivation to answer some of those questions. So I'm just wondering how, what your feelings are on that, and whether you would agree with that statement.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. You do have to have some form of valuation because we do have to make these decisions. Policy makers are going to have to make a lot of these key decisions. I just worry that the sort of traditional route that we've been following, which is to put a monetary value on the environment, isn't necessarily the way forward. Not just because actually whether or not you should have the environment should have an intrinsic value or not, but actually because it's actually ignoring the people as well, because it's not taking into account the fact that people have different needs and requirements for the environment that aren't actually captured by money. I mean, what I proposed with the sort of using disability-adjusted life years is just one idea. I mean, I think there's actually a whole, again, I mean, they're emerging generalisations, so they're sort of food for thought that actually perhaps the issue of valuation, how we could do that in a non-monetary way, is actually an area of research that needs much more thought about it.
Thanks. Janet Fisher, University of Edinburgh. Thanks for a really interesting talk. Something that I suppose I've thought about various times in the last few years as well is like you, to what extent is it a problem about this sort of proliferation of frameworks around ecosystem services and human well-being? And I suppose the most obvious problem is it's quite hard to aggregate knowledge if people are using very esoteric frameworks. So yeah, I guess the question is it inevitable, I suppose, that we have this proliferation of frameworks, and how far is it a problem? And maybe a question for some more sort of senior people in the room as well. Is this something that's particularly a facet of sort of ESPA research, or have other large kind of multidisciplinary research programs also been characterized by this kind of proliferation of frameworks?
I think it's probably inevitable. Like you just said, it's multidisciplinary, so you are going to have some way that people are trying to think on the same platform. But I suppose I feel that perhaps we've got to a saturation level, maybe. We have a lot of frameworks now, some are very good, and you do need them as guidance for how you might move on. But I think now is a bit like what sort of Elena Bennett was saying, that we actually need to move forward now and start collecting more of that empirical evidence that's going to flesh out those frameworks, test whether or not we're right about how we think things are linked together. Like I said, I can't answer your necessarily other bit of question about other sort of big programs that are using frameworks, whether that's a commonality. I imagine it is, actually, but yeah, maybe other people can answer that question because they've worked on other things at all. But
Belinda Reyes from the Stockholm Resilience Centre. Thanks, it was a really interesting summary, and I really like the ideas of beginning to think about the social outcomes, both in the poverty space, but even in the national development planning space that we were hearing about earlier today, and in local development. And it also strikes me, Kate made this point earlier today about the language we use, yeah, and the word values. And sometimes we mean that in terms of just quantifying in whatever units, and sometimes we mean it in economic terms, and sometimes we mean it in monetary terms. And IPBES has spent a significant effort now on coming up with a guide to these multiple values, and really the pluralism of values that are now arising in the ecosystem services domain. And I think the ESPA community could really make a valuable contribution in thinking more broadly about those values. So it was just a point about referencing that report, which I think is very valuable. And also maybe just, if you have any thoughts around social outcomes and how quantification or valuation might play a role in that.
Well, I'm going to go with lots of other people's answers from yesterday. I'm not a social scientist, so I probably am not the best person to ask about how those values might be incorporated. Yeah, I think we do have to draw on that reports you've just said. There has been work on this. I think the reason why I was actually just drawing attention to the word value is that people automatically assume it means price, and as you've just pointed out, it doesn't mean that. It has all these different options, and I don't think there's just room for just one either. That we thought GDP was a universal one, but actually I think there is an opportunity to have several that perhaps will contribute to an overall valuation.
Hi. Craig Barsley, ESRC. Don't know if, hopefully this can be quick, but you said that the empirical evidence of sort of the case studies is that trade-offs between ecosystem services and poverties are 3 times more common than synergies. Is that right? Which is a sort of fact that kind of stabs at the heart of the idea of ESPA, in a sense. So, I mean, and I don't know if this is answerable at the moment, and this is sort of a question for ESPA, really. But based on those sort of results, does that mean we need to rethink the approach, that it should be more about how do we manage the trade-offs, and that should be the emphasis? Or have we just not gotten there in terms of the scientific solutions, and we just need more work to increase the potential for synergies?
Well, there were still synergies, so it is still possible. And I think there's a lot to be learned from where cases have been successful, and then also comparing them to where they haven't been successful. What is it that's underpinning those? I think in certain circumstances, like I said, we had these sort of indicators as to why those trade-offs are occurring, they sort of, particularly with the private interest. Now, in our sort of very capitalist global society, I don't know how well you could manage that. So in those cases, you may have to manage for trade-offs. So I don't, the option is probably that you can't 100% get win-wins, but you could probably increase those numbers of win-wins by learning from those situations in which there were synergies. I don't know in the broader sense what ESPA would think about that, but, you know.
That's great. I'm afraid I'm going to have to draw the discussion to a close. Thank you again, Caroline, and thank you for the questions. And I'm sure that you might have an opportunity over lunch to continue these discussions. We should move on to our next speaker, please. And I'm very happy to introduce Professor Christo Fabricius from Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University in South Africa. Christo is going to talk about work outside of ESPA program, but particularly I think that will pause us to think about who and how and what really we might communicate around our science and these entry points to support ecosystem and people management, maybe.
Thank you. So this is the team that has been doing this research with me. I want to credit all of them. They're all co-authors of what I'm doing here, but any mess-ups I take full responsibility for myself. Just quick, and this is my last conceptual framework. My journey into this realm of people and ecosystems started with a bang, but not by coincidence. And it happened in August 1993 when I was a herbivore ecologist with the Nature Conservation Agency in the Eastern Cape in South Africa. I was a decision maker. I was also a researcher. And then a group of communities in one of the prized nature reserves, biodiversity hotspot in South Africa called Dwesa, invaded the protected area. And they were looking around for someone to go and sort this out. And fingers were pointed at me, partially because my manager at that stage claimed that I had somewhat bohemian tendencies, he said, because I refused to wear a uniform. And within about a week of arriving at Dwesa, I realized that my destiny had changed and that I was on a new journey. And it was on the journey of this relationship between people and ecosystems. So more recently, I started working in the wilderness. That's where I live, and that's where my study area is. And I carried this conceptual framework with me for a while, you know, and we start with a problem, and there's this pipeline. We do research, the researchers get into the system, they share their knowledge with resource users, and then you get societal benefits, and if you're lucky, then everybody has a nice cup of tea. But, of course, there's a huge problem with that conceptual framework. It does not work like that. So mind the gap. Something's wrong here. Proceed with caution. And I want to explain to you why we should proceed with caution, because I think as researchers, we're so obsessed with seeking the truth that we actually forget about seeking meaning. And there's a huge difference between the two, and I hope the rest of my talk, without conceptual frameworks, is going to illustrate some of that, and also the journey that we went on as a research team. So this is wilderness. Not going to dwell too much on the geographical location, other than to tell you it's somewhere around there between Mossel Bay and Knysna in the Western Cape. And if we look at the peoplescape of wilderness, we see it's quite complex. So there are many landscapes, but there are also many user communities on the right. And where these two come together, that's the peoplescape. So when we start conceptualizing our study area as a peoplescape, now we embark on seeking the truth. So just a little bit about wilderness. So it's more or less a tourism place, as you can see there. It's got a number of steep catchments. It's a very important tourism attraction, but also a internationally important wetland site. It's a pretty compact catchment because it's situated between the Outeniqua Mountains, the Cape Fold Mountains, and the sea. And there's serious concerns there about water quality and also the amount of water available, intensive agriculture, and, of course, this whole issue of disconnected communities and this fragmented peoplescape. So we discovered through our research that these fragmented peoplescapes are vulnerable. You have many maladaptations. People do silly things, but they only realize it afterwards because there are unintended consequences when you are fragmented like that. So on the biophysical side, you can see how fragmented, the slide's not that clear, but we've got plantation forestry, we've got dairy farms, and the entire landscape is actually broken up and disconnected. And if we see how it manifests itself at the local level, we see how riparian zones start suffering because of invasive alien plants, and ecological infrastructure becomes degraded. So there's that ecological fragmentation. But there's also social fragmentation. So this is the township of Toosranton. These were people who were forcibly removed into that area because of historical policies, and they still remain in the system. And then you have these very affluent farming communities, plantation owners, and so on around it. So there's social fragmentation, but this is how it manifests itself at the local level, right? So many signs that say intruders will be shot and survivors will be shot again. So that kind of humor. So the peoplescape is fragmented. And what do we then do as researchers? Because surely we're part of the system. So first of all, what we do, what researchers do, we start seeking the truth, right? We collect a lot of data. And we had interesting findings. It's also with the Pro-EcoServe project that Belinda referred to earlier, fed into this. And yeah, climate change is going to create some natural hazards, and ecosystem change is as important as climate change. Invasive trees is a real problem, and that we can create jobs through private-public partnerships, and all these graphs and models and so on. That's the journey to seek the truth. And also this water quality. So water quality indices were developed, lovely GIS maps, and how the river flows have actually changed. That some of these rivers have decreased their flow by effectively 80% because of abstraction for mainly dairy farming and plantation forestry. So that's the pursuit of the truth. But there's this other part of it, and that's seeking meaning. And I became a bit disenchanted with this quest for the truth because it wasn't really having an impact. And so I want to focus the rest of my talk on this bit, and that's this journey of building trust with stakeholders and giving people an excuse to follow their hearts, because what we found is that people want to do the right thing, but they're up against conventions, they're up against a whole bunch of other pressures that are preventing them from doing that. And we as scientists, maybe we can just be the catalyst to give people an excuse to do what they believe is the right thing to do anyway. So just to show you a few things here, that person there works for South Africa National Park. So he's actually a decision maker, but he's part of the research team. So he's helping us to collect data. He's helping us to give presentations to stakeholders. That person there is the chairman of the Local Ratepayers Association. So when we get a group of visitors to the catchment, we draw him in. So he needs to provide his perspective about the story, about the meaning of the place and what's going on. Fueled, of course, by information that we provided as well, sharing information with him. That person there is a leader in the farming community. He's a very, very progressive farmer, extremely affluent. He's part of our research team. So we bring a group of winter school students to his farm, and he gets a chance to address them about his cows and the problems that the invasive plants and the ecological infrastructure are actually creating for him as a very affluent farmer. The other thing we also do is we act as interpreters. So this is a government meeting, and what they're trying to tell the farmers is, this is the limitations to water use we're going to impose on you. It's a process called the ecological reserve. It's the amount of water that needs to be left behind in the river that you can't use anymore. So when researchers attend these farmers' meetings, instead of standing in the front and doing complex tables like that, we sit in the back, but we act as interpreters. Afterwards, during tea time, we have discussions with people to interpret this complex information, to learn with them about the challenges that they face when this happens. The other one is this listening issue. So to me, a dialogue is the skill of listening with fascination, not just waiting for someone to finish their story, clarifying our assumptions and putting them on the table, asking very incisive questions both ways, and treating each other as thinking peers. So we started using these Knowledge Cafe and World Cafe processes, create a third place where people can come together, third place meaning it's neither home nor work. It's another space. Often the university's campus could play that role, but sometimes it's school halls. And then we create a nice atmosphere that tells the stakeholders, you matter, your voice matters. Get them into small groups, drink very good quality coffee, and have conversations founded in listening and mutual respect. So here's one of our dialogues. It's in the local school hall. You can see even the local school kids are helping us organize the tables because their parents are part of the farming community. And we sit around and really put our hearts on the table and share that information. So we've been doing these dialogues now very regularly, and we find that every time we have them, they're even better attended than before because people have this feeling that they're being listened to and that they matter. The other one is this adventure learning. So it's one thing sharing knowledge, but it's another doing stuff. So, for example, this is a community hacking day that was organized in collaboration with our colleagues in South African national parks, sandparks. They're part of the project, as I said earlier. We're doing stuff, but we're also sharing information while we're doing it. It's phenomenal when people start making this physical investment of actually taking action together, how that affirms the message and the knowledge that's been shared before. Here's another one where some of our research team members and officials go on this journey up the river to explore with the farmers actually how this river has changed since its origins at the top of the mountain going down into the lower floodplains. And then using maps and stories, metaphors as boundary objects. So here are just a few quotes. Our river is our future. It's a metaphor. Right? The future is no longer this abstract thing. It's coupled to the river, which is the lifeblood. It's like our bodies. We neglect it, and it gets sick. And these ladies said the lakes are like our kidneys. So if they don't function, then the water that gets through them is a problem. So these are fisher ladies that we had conversations with. And sometimes these conversations can get very heated, right, when people start using metaphors that clash with each other because their objectives might be different. And then just collectively exploring these alternative futures and coming up with a vision that is not very corporate, right? So the vision, we want a healthy river system. We want a healthy community. We want it through joint effort, and we go beyond our backyards. So that's what the stakeholders are saying. That's the community-generated vision for the catchment. So what have we learned? Okay. So the first one is that this thing is never static. So there are actually many pathways that the system can follow. And it's fueled by a bunch of things. Uncertainties, obviously. I'm very close to a conceptual framework, am I not? Sorry about that. This social connectedness feeding into knowledge, awareness, capacity, motivation, and a whole bunch of other things feeding into these responses. Those are things that we end up doing. And these responses can take us down these pathways, which could be maladaptive, but they could also take us into this adaptive space. And the choice is ours. And it's a very simple diagram that we share with people to say, but there are many choices. And the choices are actually ours, and there are many different directions that this thing called our catchment, our future, can go. So just a list of things that we've actually learned one by one. So the first one is seeking the truth is a challenge, but seeking meaning is a real adventure. And that quote, it's just so much easier to count the bottles, but to describe the wine is a very different story. It really takes creativity. You've got to dig deep. Second point, these stories and maps, and metaphors, they're boundary objects, and they can help us to connect fragmented landscapes. They're not the only thing, but they help. We as researchers, we're in the thick of things, right? We cannot stand by as independent observers and watch this boat float by. So society wants to listen to our stories, but they want to add that to their own sense of meaning. So we don't create the meaning. We add to the meaning that's already there. And maybe we create more meaning through that. We can be bridging agents, and we can be mirror holders like that picture at the bottom there. Ourselves, when we talk about transdisciplinarity, we need a helping hand because we're in these academic trenches. We need to escape them. And these maps, metaphors, and stories and working with decision makers and with communities actually help us to get out of these trenches like a little ladder. So this is it. People act on their emotions. They do incorporate facts, but facts is not actually what get people into action. Trust is really the thing. They need to believe. They need to follow their hearts, but with meaning and with purpose. So we're just part of that. And then, we talk about zip-zap research. Drawing a map or two, playing a game or three about this thing called alleviating poverty. And I think, I'm afraid to say, it's all an illusion. Thank you. That's the end of my talk.
Thank you very much, Christo. Can I invite questions from the audience in response to it's all an illusion and maybe escaping some of our academic trenches?
You'll get your chance.
Hi, Christo. It's great to see how you've been engaging the community, and I was just wondering if you've been able to map your engagement to outcomes on the ground. Have you seen changes in the environment based on your interactions?
We've seen changes in the environment, yes. We've seen positive things happening in terms of governance and in terms of people's meaning of place. We've seen positive changes in terms of our own credibility as a research team and as an institution. We've seen stakeholders come together and start tackling invasive alien plants, for example, and ecological infrastructure together. But honestly, I can't say that if we hadn't been there, this would not have happened, and I wouldn't claim that. What I can say, Kelly, is that we're part of the system. And we evolve together with the system. And as it changes, we're also changing and responding. And maybe another side of that question is actually, have we seen changes in ourselves as a result of the process? And I can tell you there, the answer is definitely yes.
Thank you. It was a very interesting presentation. I have one question. Also coming from my social sciences background, where you have action research, reflexivity as kind of core concepts in social research. You put in your slide, you have in your slides that you have a seeking the truth process, and then a seeking meaning process. But my question will be, to what extent does seeking meaning section actually fed back into your seeking the truth process? Because to what extent talking to people, interacting to people, made you rethink and maybe reinterpret your truth that you initially found without talking to people? Well, as I assume from your representation, but I don't know. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there are definitely those positive feedbacks. But at the risk of kind of sounding like a cop-out type researcher, I think the truth is just so elusive. So once you think you have it, then it slips out of your fingers and it moves on. So I don't know about the truth, because it sort of seems to be a moving target. But meaning is also like that, because meaning is also constantly changing. And yeah, so I don't know if that answers.
Yeah, I found it a very interesting talk. In fact, we've done similar things in China. What I wanted to ask you is, to what extent you think as scientists you actually have the right level of knowledge about your environment to actually inform the people,
Yeah.
or to act as translators.
Yeah.
So to what level do you feel you have the truth of understanding of the environment?
Yeah. Okay. So the first thing is that we have a mindset that says this is a complex adaptive system. So the system is constantly shifting, changing, responding to different attractors, and so on. So I think that's a contribution. The other one is that we have been collecting an enormous amount of biophysical information about water quality and quantity changes, for example, landscape change. There's also information about sea temperatures, coastal sea level rise, and holding that up and as part of the picture, and using that as a mirror to people and say, well, this is happening. It's not everything that's happening. But we've got something to contribute here that you, with your local knowledge, might not have realized. And somehow I feel that's maybe the best we could hope for, as scientific experts, is if we don't make that contribution, who else is going to do it?
Time for one final question.
So you talked about how increasing the meaning, or seeking meaning with these communities help to improve their sense of place and help to, I guess you're alluding to, help them understand their connection or reconnect them to the environment. We talk a lot about how to value or quantify cultural services, but do you think work like this doesn't necessarily quantify, but evidences that type of that evidences the cultural services existing and coming from the environment? And do you think that's enough? That's enough to show that it's happening and it's there, and actually to quantify them any further than that isn't necessary or useful?
Sounds like a leading question. I don't think one should, but I mean, I'm not really from that scientific community, so I must just say that. But I think it's unnecessary to quantify it, because that quantification again is just one type of meaning, and it can actually be very misleading. And I have a suspicion it could be disappointingly small, actually. But the reality, the bigger issue, of social ecological transformation and societal transformation and transformation in governance systems, I think that's huge. But I don't know how you put a value on that, because it's going to manifest itself into the future. Right now, it's a bit fuzzy.
But that's kind of what I'm trying to ask you about. Is this enough? Is this type of work enough that it just evidences that it's happening and people are connecting and there is a sense of place and there is an enhanced sense of community because of the natural environment? So is this enough for us to know that this happens and it exists?
No, it's not enough.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm afraid we need to draw this this session to an end, because lunch is waiting. But I'd like to thank both the speakers for really great talks, which I think, both interestingly put people right at the centre of, an ESPA agenda, and I think both sort of challenge us in really significant ways about, what ESPA as a programme can contribute, about how, it might move forward, and about, in a way, the role of projects and, funded research projects in, sort of building these relationships of trust and of being able to facilitate some of these different processes. So thank you very much, and thank you for your questions. And you have about 45 minutes for lunch, which is being served back in the other room.